Soviet villagers scattered in every direction as the roar of the Luftwaffe bombers above them fades into the distance. Some run barefoot, others clutching children. Behind them, their homes are in flames. Something worse than the German army is coming. In the tree line beyond the wreckage, a Soviet soldier spots a lone figure dressed in black, with a strange emblem barely visible on his collar. The soldier lunges with his bayonet, but the man in black moves with supernatural speed. Now on his back, the bloodied Soviet struggles desperately as the black-clad figure pins him with one hand, drawing a bizarre ceremonial dagger with the other. The Soviet sees something in his attacker's hollow eyes that tells him he should be fearing more than just death. Wehrmacht soldiers approaching from a distance turn away. Even they cannot bear to witness what is about to happen next. The Seed of Evil. On the night of November 8th, 1923, the Bürger Braukeller, one of Munich's largest beer halls, was filled with over 3,000 people gathered to hear a nationalist speech by Gustav von Kahr, the state commissioner of Bavaria. At first glance, it was just another political rally in post-war Germany. But outside, the paramilitary forces of the rising Nazi party were beginning to mobilize. At 9:30 p.m., a 34-year-old Adolf Hitler stormed into the hall, flanked by around 20 armed Nazi leaders who shoved their way through the crowd. However, as the noise drowned them out, Hitler drew his pistol, fired into the ceiling, and climbed onto a chair as he exclaimed, quote, "The National Revolution has broken out. The hall is surrounded by 600 men. Nobody is allowed to leave." Hitler proceeded to force Kahr and two other top officials into a back room at gunpoint, declaring the Bavarian government deposed and announcing the formation of a new provisional government under his leadership. But Kahr didn't fold, and when released a few hours later, he immediately ordered the police to suppress the uprising. With his plan cracking, Hitler led 2,000 Nazi supporters into the streets of Munich. Though most weren't soldiers, they marched in military formation toward the Bavarian Defense Ministry, many holding arms and wearing brown uniforms. But as they reached the Odeonsplatz, they found their path blocked by 130 Bavarian state police officers standing in a tight cordon. No one knows who fired the first shot, but in an instant, a firefight erupted. 16 Nazis were gone in less than a minute, including Max Erwin von Scheupner-Richter, who was walking arm in arm with Hitler. As Scheupner-Richter collapsed, he dragged Hitler down with him, who, upon dislocating his shoulder, had to be pulled from the scene by his bodyguard. 2 days later, Hitler was found hiding in the countryside. He was arrested and later sentenced to 5 years in prison for treason, though he served only 9 months. Among those who marched next to him in Munich was a young fanatic named Heinrich Himmler. After the failed coup, Himmler became obsessed with Nazi ideology, idolizing Hitler and formally joining the Schutzstaffel, or SS, the paramilitary force that served as Hitler's personal guard. Fueled by the promise of a racially pure Aryan empire, Himmler approached Hitler with a vision: to build an armed force that would ensure the Nazis never suffered another defeat like they had in Munich. A force composed of loyal, lethal, ideologically indoctrinated men, unshakably devoted to the Führer. As soon as Himmler finished proposing his plan, Hitler knew he had found the mastermind he needed for his rising empire. He named Himmler Deputy Reichsführer SS and tasked him with shaping the most powerful paramilitary machine the world had ever seen. The making of a perfect soldier. After the Nazi Party seized power in the early 1930s, SS training centers began to appear across Germany. However, these were not meant to teach the more traditional tactics of the Wehrmacht, Nazi Germany's official military forces, which centered around mass conscription and rigid battlefield doctrines. Instead, Himmler and other officials were more interested in creating fast and ruthless elite forces that could carry out strikes without following the conventional rules of war. Upon months of schooling, ordinary young men were transformed into shock troops. Their training was brutal. Recruits were drilled in small arms mastery, camouflage, topographical navigation, mountain climbing, and crossing freezing rivers with full gear. They ran up to 15 miles, loaded with heavy packs, then endured 24-mile marches under punishing, often staged, surprise conditions designed to break the weak. Under the Wehrmacht, SS units rejected the principles of trench warfare and instead embraced a new kind of stormtrooper tactics. close-quarters combat with bayonets, knives, and shovels. Physical combat training was fused with organized sports like boxing, wrestling, and even judo, meant to keep the cadets in top condition while also unifying the ranks. For the SS, it was crucial to instill a sense of brotherhood amongst the troops. Officers and enlisted men shared barracks and meals, with the term Sir discouraged, even when addressing Himmler himself. Military hierarchy was rejected in favor of a cult-like unity. Everyone, from cadet to commander, was bound by loyalty to the Nazi Party rather than by rank. In fact, the SS training put indoctrination above all else. Cadets studied Hitler's Mein Kampf like scripture, absorbing anti-Christian dogma, racial supremacy theories, and propaganda portraying communism as a global disease. 3 times a week, these lessons drilled the Nazi worldview into their psyche. Those who failed ideological evaluations, roughly 1 in 3, were dismissed on the spot. By the time war officially erupted in 1939, Himmler had already transformed the SS from a personal guard unit into one of the most feared and ideologically driven military machines in Hitler's arsenal, one that was not afraid to fight with their bare fists if needed, and give their own lives for the Nazi cause. A beast unleashed. On September 1st, 1939, Poland was struck from 3 directions: Nazi Germany from the west, Slovakia from the south, and East Prussia from the north. It was the opening blow of the invasion Hitler had envisioned for years, the official start of World War II. At the forefront of the assault was the Wehrmacht, executing a swift, coordinated attack designed to crush Polish defenses before they could properly mobilize. Not far behind them, the Waffen-SS, the armed wing of the Schutzstaffel, followed. Before deployment, Heinrich Himmler addressed his troops one last time, quote, "Men of the SS, I expect you to do more than just your duty." Among the deployed Waffen-SS units was the 1st Panzer-Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, a formation already feared across Germany before they had even set foot on the battlefield. Fiercely loyal to Hitler and Hitler alone, its men had proven their ruthlessness upon taking part in the bloody purge of the Sturmabteilung during the Night of the Long Knives, assassinating fellow Nazis deemed politically unreliable. However, the violence they had directed against fellow Germans was merely a warm-up to what they were about to unleash beyond their motherland's borders. As they advanced deeper into Poland, their mission shifted from combat to terror. Convinced by Nazi propaganda that the enemy was subhuman, these SS units committed the worst types of crimes as they pierced through Polish territory. Survivors of the initial Luftwaffe bombings found themselves caught in a new nightmare as the Waffen-SS set fire to their houses and reduced entire villages to ash. No distinctions were made. Men, women, the elderly, and children were all treated as obstacles to be eliminated. For those who weren't taken out outright, a different fate awaited. Captured civilians became some of the first victims of Nazi detention, imprisoned, abused, and subjected to early versions of the horrors that would soon define the regime's genocide tactics. Even the Wehrmacht, no stranger to war's brutality, took issue with the SS's methods and even requested its dissolution, complaining about their lack of discipline and claiming that, despite excelling at spreading terror, when it came to securing actual victories, the Waffen-SS fell short. However, Heinrich Himmler had no intention of letting his force be dismantled so easily. He went straight to Hitler, framing the SS's failures not as flaws in leadership or ideology, but as the result of insufficient resources. He argued they hadn't failed. They had been held back. What they needed was access to better weapons, modern armor, and specialized units that would make them even more dangerous. The Führer agreed with him. Fanatics in action. As the war escalated, Adolf Hitler expanded the capabilities of the Waffen-SS, granting them access to increasingly sophisticated weaponry and battlefield tools. The Waffen-SS was suddenly outfitted with advanced equipment, armored vehicles, and real artillery for training. SS training schools evolved into specialized academies. New branches were established to teach a wide range of disciplines: artillery bombardment, combat engineering, battlefield medicine, cavalry operations, mountain warfare, signal coordination, and anti-tank tactics. These institutions became factories of heavily armed Nazi fanatics, churning out thousands of warriors who would provide the decisive push in critical battles during the early years of the war. When the Nazis launched their blitzkrieg into France in 1940, The Waffen-SS became the weapon Hitler unleashed when he needed to eradicate any semblance of resistance, often deployed into areas where the Wehrmacht had already suffered setbacks. During the drive across the Low Countries, elite SS units helped forge the German breakthrough, capturing Merville in violent street-to-street fighting and repelling British armored counterattacks. With their support, German forces pushed deeper into France, reaching as far as Saint-Étienne, just 250 miles from Paris, and helping achieve the encirclement of the British Expeditionary Force near Dunkirk. Even as their battlefield tactics evolved, the Waffen-SS never abandoned their cruel methods. For them, violence was part of their doctrine, and committing war crimes became routine wherever they operated. The 2nd SS Panzerdivision, known as Das Reich, a mechanized formation that became critical for the invasion by capturing fortified positions, was also known for executing thousands of prisoners of war, often as reprisals against local populations when civilians dared to resist. Still, even the atrocities of Das Reich seemed restrained compared to those committed by the 3rd SS Panzerdivision, Totenkopf. Formed from former concentration camp guards, the Totenkopf Division bore the feared Death's Head insignia, a stark skull emblazoned on caps and collars. To see that emblem was to know that mercy would not be given. At the village of La Paradis in France, 97 British soldiers who had surrendered and laid down their arms were lined up by Totenkopf troops. Instead of being taken prisoner, they were gunned down with machine guns. The massacre was merciless, with only 2 men crawling away from the carnage to tell the tale, spreading the story across the globe as a warning of what the Waffen-SS were capable of. The Nazis did not hesitate to deploy this murderous force again and again. When Hitler's armies charged into the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the Waffen-SS led some of the most savage fighting of the entire war. They leveled towns, razed villages, and annihilated entire populations on the march toward Leningrad, making no distinction between soldiers and civilians. Foreign blood. When Heinrich Himmler first conceived the Waffen-SS, he envisioned a paramilitary force that was an embodiment of the Aryan Superman that Adolf Hitler idolized, with recruits being required to meet strict physical standards, perfect health and records, athletic builds, and a minimum height of 5'7". A notable lineage wasn't mandatory, but proving one's Aryan ancestry was a frequent demand. However, as Hitler's empire spread across Europe and the demands of war intensified, something began to shift within the ranks of the Waffen-SS. The campaigns in France and the Soviet Union had bled the SS dry, and to replenish its ranks, the regime began to look out from Germany and toward the numerous territories under Nazi control. Through propaganda campaigns, they began to sell the war as a crusade against the Soviet menace, an honorable combat to preserve Europe from Bolshevism, which promised glory and a purpose to foreign men who joined the Nazi cause. For some, this message struck a chord. Believers in fascism, hoping to curry favor in Hitler's future Europe, and men seeking protection began to enlist. Others joined under pressure or at gunpoint. Regardless of motive, the recruitment seemed to pay off. At its peak, the Waffen-SS boasted nearly 1 million men, of which fewer than half were Reich Germans, and over 550,000 hailed from outside the borders of pre-war Germany. To justify the crumbling racial criteria, Himmler reframed the Waffen-SS as a pan-European army. He first opened the ranks to men from Germanic brother nations, the Dutch, Norwegians, Danes, and Finns, who were considered racially compatible. But as Germany's war efforts began to falter, even these boundaries became blurry. The Nazi racial hierarchy cracked down, and the once prized Aryan purity within the Waffen-SS gave way to ranks that included Ukrainians, Latvians, Estonians, Croats, Bosnian Muslims, Hungarians, Romanians, Russians, and even volunteers from India and Central Asia. In the short term, the strategy gave the Germans the extra force they needed. Foreign divisions like the 5th SS Panzerdivision, Viking, which included Dutch, Danish, Norwegian, and Finnish recruits, became one of the most effective multinational formations in the Waffen-SS. Meanwhile, the 13th Waffen Mountain Division, Handschar, composed mainly of Bosnian Muslims, played a key role in the Balkans, albeit at the cost of numerous war crimes in the region. But it didn't take long before cracks began to show with this new approach to recruitment. Many of the foreign volunteers lacked the fanaticism and intensive preparation of their German counterparts. Some were just given basic training before being sent to the front lines, where inevitably they would suffer numerous losses. Morale waned, and inside the ranks, deep divisions emerged. German SS veterans often viewed their foreign comrades as racially and militarily inferior, unworthy of wearing the same uniform. The bonds of shared ideology that had once made the Waffen-SS such a unified force were breaking apart. Collapse. As 1943 rolled in, the Waffen-SS was no longer the elite fighting force it once was, and its situation would only worsen in the campaign set to conquer the Soviet city of Kursk. By mid-July, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, under the command of General Paul Hauser, surged into Soviet territory, driving toward the rail hub of Prokhorovka. Victory there would offer a critical gateway into the rest of the nation, a last chance to turn the tide of the war before it tipped definitively against Germany. On July 11th, after a grind through 2 fortified Soviet defensive belts, Hauser's SS divisions had clawed their way to within 2 miles of Prokhorovka. The prize was almost within reach, but the Red Army would not let the Waffen-SS roll through unopposed. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, anticipating the German thrust, ordered the 5th Guards Tank Army into action. Under the command of General Pavel Romestrov, over 600 Soviet tanks began to move. At dawn on July 12th, the plains of Prokhorovka trembled as Romestrov's voice came across Soviet radios around 8:30 a.m. with a single command, calling all men to attack, shouting, quote, "Steal, steal, steal." From the ridgelines, the SS tanks, including Tiger 1s, were dug in and waiting. Their long-barreled guns pointed at the approaching Soviets in the distance. But the Red Army's T-34s would not be intimidated, and with infantry clinging to their hulls, the Soviet tanks surged forward, closing the distance to engage at point-blank range and overwhelm the Tiger's superior firepower. Explosions expanded throughout the battlefield as hundreds of tanks clashed in one of the most savage tank battles the world had ever seen. SS tank crews fought back wave after wave of Soviet armor, the barrels of their Panzer IVs burning hot from non-stop firing. Temporary gains were made as some units pierced Soviet lines and cleared a path forward. But the Soviets kept marching, and as the SS units regrouped, the Germans suddenly realized nearly half their armor was gone. Just as the battle appeared to be won by the Soviets, reinforcements came from the sky. The Luftwaffe swept over the battlefield and unleashed a storm of bombs upon the advancing Soviet formations. Explosions erupted across the field as T-34s were torn apart or set ablaze. The shockwave of air power stalled the Red Army's momentum and forced them back to their original positions. The SS had fought their way to within striking distance of Prokhorovka, farther than any other German formation had gotten in the Kursk region. In the process, they tore through multiple Soviet defensive belts and inflicted devastating losses. However, this had come at a heavy price, and as the smoke settled over the battlefield, it became clear that the Waffen-SS had met its match in the Red Army. Though they still held the field, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps was too battered to continue the offensive for much longer. Hauser's elite divisions had battled the Soviets to a standstill, but they could not keep on fighting an enemy with endless reserves, and within days, Hitler ordered the operation to be called off. It was the end of Germany's last major offensive in the East, and the beginning of a long and slow collapse for the Waffen-SS. The final fight. By the spring of 1945, grenadiers from the last standing SS divisions dashed in their black uniforms through the ruins of Berlin as the sound of Soviet artillery kept growing closer. The Red Army was approaching fast, but in the depths of the Führer bunker, Hitler still clung to his delusions, issuing frantic orders for a final stand and assuring himself this was not the end of the Third Reich. At first, German troops obeyed, but as Soviet bombs pulverized the city and communication lines were severed, discipline disintegrated. Wehrmacht units began to fall back or surrender entirely, leaving the Waffen-SS and scattered diehards to wage the final defense. Driven by blind loyalty, many Waffen-SS soldiers resolved to fight to keep the battle going, no matter the cost. However, they were no longer the hardened veterans who had once stormed across Europe. These were mostly foreign volunteers and teenage boys from the Hitler Youth, some barely 16. In the shadow of the Reichstag, SS machine gunners crouched behind shattered barricades, firing through gaping holes in walls, picking off Red Army soldiers as they crossed boulevards choked in smoke. Waffen-SS squads turned entire neighborhoods into war zones, setting booby traps beneath doorways and ambushing tanks with Panzerfausts, their warheads taking out entire units of Soviet armor in narrow corridors. As the Soviets poured into Berlin's center, they met resistance unlike anything they'd seen. Inside the Reichstag, SS troops had dug deep trenches and fortified every level. The building, already gutted from a fire years before, became a fortress filled with machine gun nests. Hours of hand-to-hand combat raged over every stairwell and corridor. Grenades bounced off marble columns, and flamethrowers burned across rooms. Even after Hitler took his own life on April 30th, and Berlin's fate was sealed, the Waffen-SS refused to lay down arms. With dwindling ammunition, they continued to fight until they no longer had a bullet to fire. By May 2nd, the Third Reich's capital had collapsed, and the last Waffen-SS fighters either fell in the final assaults, took their own lives, or tried to disappear into the sea of terrified civilians. For those captured alive, there was no mercy. The Red Army remembered the burning remains of their villages and the unspeakable cruelty the SS had shown to their victims. For them, there would be no trial, and in the ruins of Berlin, they got their revenge, executing captured SS men where they stood. Some men tried to run or convince the Soviets they did not belong to the Waffen. But even without their uniforms, the Red Army could see the tattoos on their skin with the unmistakable markings of the group. Once it was revealed that a German soldier belonged to the SS, there were no further questions asked. Fall of the Mastermind. While countless Waffen-SS troops fell, Heinrich Himmler, the man who had created and commanded them, was already plotting his escape. As the Third Reich came crashing down, Himmler opened secret negotiations with the Allies, hoping to save his own skin before Germany's total defeat. But there was one problem. First, he had to whitewash all his crimes. Himmler attempted to downplay the vast scale of SS atrocities, alleging that the crematoria at the camps were just a precaution against a typhus outbreak, and that the casualty toll in those cruel prisons had been exaggerated. But his deception backfired. News of his betrayal reached back to the Nazi command, earning him expulsion from the party, stripping of all titles, and officially casting him out by the empire he had helped build. He was no longer the feared commander of the SS, just a fugitive with a false name. Like many former SS officers seeking to avoid capture and execution, Himmler shed his black uniform and disguised himself as a low-ranking army sergeant. Under the alias Heinrich Hitzinger, he fled north, drifting through Germany in hopes of slipping unnoticed. But on May 21st, at a checkpoint in Bremervode, he was stopped by former Soviet prisoners of war who had survived the horrors of the Nazi camps he had helped create. Luckily for Himmler, the soldiers didn't recognize him. Still, his papers raised suspicions. Transferred from camp to camp, he eventually arrived at the British 31st Civilian Interrogation Camp near Lüneburg. There, something felt off when officials noticed an unusual stamp on his identity documents, one known to have been used by fleeing SS officers. On May 23rd, Himmler was brought in for a routine medical examination. When the doctor asked him to open his mouth, Himmler resisted. Then, in one sudden motion, he jerked his head and bit down on a cyanide capsule hidden behind his molar. In seconds, the man who once commanded the most lethal paramilitary group the world had seen fell to the floor. Within 15 minutes, he was gone. The British buried Himmler in an unmarked grave, whose location, to this day, remains unknown. The price of fanaticism. As for the Waffen-SS veterans who survived the war, their fates varied drastically depending on which country they ended up in and how badly their hands were stained by the crimes of the regime. At the Nuremberg trials, the Waffen-SS was declared a criminal organization. Its members were held responsible for atrocities on the battlefield and in the concentration camps. Many had taken part in horrific war crimes. Still, there were exceptions made for the men who had been conscripted into the Waffen-SS by force in the last years of the war, and those who could not be proven to have participated directly in atrocities against war prisoners. However, in post-war West Germany, Even those who escaped legal punishment found no easy return to their communities. For foreign SS volunteers, the stigma was even worse. In their homelands, they were deemed as traitors who had taken up arms against their own countries, branded as social pariahs and shunned by their communities. Many former SS members lived in isolation, unable to escape from their dark past. Some veterans, refusing to accept their new life, banded together into veteran lobby groups, hoping to clean the image of the Waffen-SS. Still, the fate of the men in Western Europe was far more merciful than what awaited their comrades behind the Iron Curtain. One former SS man recalled, quote, "When they saw my uniform, they dragged me out of the line of prisoners. They beat me with rifle butts. I understood why." The least fortunate were thrown into Soviet labor camps and sentenced to years of grueling work meant to repay the destruction they had brought to the nation. There, in frozen forests, many simply wasted away, working until they could stand no more, and then swiftly replaced without ceremony. Every day, names were read aloud, and the men who were called would never be seen again.